before we start, I'm going to play a QuickTime movie behind me. And the first, don't start it yet because it's noisy. I want to explain that the first 30 seconds is Blood Rain, and I sort of love her and sort of hate her. She is a game character that emerged. She was introduced on the cover of Playboy in 2004, and she sort of stimulated me to begin this body of work that you will see playing behind me while I talk. And the other thing I'm going to say before I talk the spiel is that what I'm actually going to do is read a paper. It's not a paper, it's an article that I wrote for Cultural Politics, which is a journal out of Duke University. And the editor is Joy Garnett. And I discovered tonight that she's figures in the collection here and has done a number of projects here, which I didn't realize when I started. And the article is called Beginning and End Games, an Educational Love Story, so it fit. And now we can begin, and we'll start. Everything after Blood Rain is me. And it's not as noisy. So anyway, for many years, I was primarily a painter, and I exhibited paintings, objects, and photographs in the contemporary art context, first in New York, beginning in 1988, and later in Berlin. Then, in the late 1990s, I began working with three-dimensional or 3D computer imaging for the first time. So that's a piece by me, and everything else will be after this. In the mid-90s, 3D animation software, or Maya as it is called, that's the software that I use, was not available for the personal computer. It was supported exclusively on the Unix operating system. Typically available only in large corporations or academic institutions. So in 1997, I began taking classes at New York University's Center for Advanced Digital Applications in order to gain access both to Maya and to the center's sophisticated computer labs. Learning 3D animation was challenging, and although I was an early adopter of computers, nothing I had previously done prepared me for the mathematical and technical rigor of spatial 3D imaging or the culture that surrounded it. When it came to courses in Maya, there were hardly any women enrolled in the classes. I was also one of the only a small number of artists, of contemporary artists working with the software. Since then, until recently, 3D animation and imaging existed completely outside the purview of contemporary art discourse. There are a number of factors that explain this situation. One being that the technology was still quite novel, having been previously used mainly by the US Department of Defense to create flight simulations. And another is that the gaming industry that has since popularized 3D animation was then only nascent. And although Maya has since become an entertainment industry standard, in many ways this technology is alien and remains a challenge conceptually because it represents a distinct break from the analogical photographic model of representation that has been the cultural standard since the 19th century. Reality is simulated in 3D animation, not through capture like photography, but rather by modeling a parallel universe inside the computer, sort of, and then outputting it. In that sense, 3D animation is truly post-photographic, and as such, is still little understood both inside and outside the art world. In 2000, I started teaching as a visiting instructor at Brooklyn's Pratt Institute in a department then called Computer Graphics and Interactive Media. Although Pratt is a serious fine arts school, at that time its computer art department was production-oriented and more or less an extension of the global engineering culture. I began to understand the students' needs as vocational in nature. They desired entry not into the world of contemporary art, but into what historian of science Timothy Lenoir, then chair of the program in History and Philosophy of Science at Stanford, identified as the military entertainment complex in about 2000. And I draw heavily on his research. It's primary research that he did, and a lot of what I talk about is substantiated by his research. The program was very demanding, as it was believed that mastering the elaborate Maya software interface required hours of memorization by rote. Its ultimate purpose was to train digital workers to staff prescribed stations in the production pipelines of multi-million-dollar Hollywood effects films or elaborate shooter games. Soon, this art school training was to serve mainly as boot camp for the armies of the military entertainment complex. Professional mainstream 3D culture has always been largely homosocial. And I don't mean homosexual by that, I mean guys. And its users generally form a kind of hypermasculinist boys' club. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, my colleagues and later my students tended to be somewhat more rigid in their outlook than the typical art school student was. They were not interested in seeking out the unfamiliar, and they were closed to reflective thought and resistant to analytic reading of the world around them. And by that, I mean a critical reading of the social world around them, which is typical in art schools, really. Artists pose themselves as cultural critics, for the most part, in contemporary art. As a woman and as a contemporary artist submerged in this militaristic and highly macho pedagogical environment, I experienced an unanticipated pedagogical political awakening. I was making art as well as teaching, all while coming to terms with this particular subculture of male-dominated digitality. And I found that I wanted to subvert earlier dichotomies of women versus nature as pitted against the civilized, scientific, masculine world of technology. Hence, I started exploring themes that incorporated unequivocal romantic imagery, predominantly a 3D female, often nude, moving slowly and sensually. And the pieces I'm showing are excerpts. I think I made 2 or 3 minute excerpts of a number of pieces so you get a range. Before long, my art and my pedagogical work began to merge when I produced a series of short films as in-class tutorials for 3D character animation. So I would actually make these as demos in class. The shorts fed into processes that developed my current body of work, sensual virtual images of the female figure moving within mechanized depictions of nature. Introspective and slow-moving, these works present a distinct departure from the ways women are depicted in first-person shooter games, which is usually pornographic or extremely violent and dehumanizing. By using the same 3D medium to create figures that reference romantic femininity while eschewing ubiquitous strategies of speed and endgame shooter mentality, I'm positing feminine beauty and erotic sensualism as a kind of refusal. Ophelia, which is that one, which I did in 2008, is one example of such slowed down sensualism and subversion of the shooter game, inspired by British artist John Everett Millay's 1852 painting depicting Hamlet's Ophelia drowned in a stream. I was interested in using this image partly for its Luddite pedigree. Millay was a pre-Raphaelite, part of a movement that promoted a return to medieval arts and crafts at a historical moment that coincided with the birth of the Industrial Revolution. His was an epic that, like our own, sustained a tremendous technological paradigm shift. With that in mind, I thought I would invert the Luddite mantra and make my Ophelia the harbinger of the new digital era. Also, Ophelia is the embodiment of romantic tragedy, a feminist figure who personifies the Electra complex, a mad woman who drowned herself for love of a man who murdered her father. There is even a third tragic subtext here, the collision between the technological and the natural worlds. My mechanized Ophelia floats at the bottom of a sea, littered with refuse and plastic bags, an ode to our own, possibly lost natural world. In a sense, Ophelia is symbolic of my own artistic practice. She represents the transformation of nature into a kind of automaton in which the artificial and the natural come together in an uncanny way. She is at once dead and fake, and yet hyper-real, alive, in a tense, uncanny fusion. Soon after, I began teaching as an adjunct at Pratt. Soon after that, traumatizing world events intervened, and in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, a hard and decisive shift towards a boot camp mentality occurred in the popular culture of 3D animation. Changing along with it was a demographic of students enrolled in computer games programs at Pratt and at all the other engineering and vocationally oriented schools where I later taught. Students now flock to the vocational training schools connected to art schools, community colleges, and polytechnic universities to learn 3D animation techniques they believed would lead to a job. Notably, a plethora of shooter games were produced that became a significant part of an at-war American military consciousness. Later, during the Iraq War years, 3D games were to grow into a larger, more profitable industry than that of 3D animated children's films. This change bears a direct relationship to the strategy of economic cross-fertilization promoted by the US military in order to develop simulation technologies for military training enactments. And this was also Lenoir's research. Lenoir, in his various writings on the subject, describes a history in which military scientists entered the commercial computer game industry with its vastly superior production budgets to further develop technologies used for flight simulations and war games. Later, after the development in the commercial realm, these popular interactive shooter games could be redeployed by the military. This is something I actually did recently. In my earlier experiences teaching 3D animation, I blamed everything on the militaristic game industry. But the 3D problem is also attributable to a consciousness limited by reductive thinking, a result of pedagogical structures borrowed from the corporate industry production pipeline, reified in the name of the production of blockbuster effects films. That's one of my students, actually, Casey. He's my first living avatar, and he's a guy. So let's see. These skills are taught with an eye towards rigorous, narrow specialization. Students are taught to resist big picture thinking, which also means to resist thinking that is conceptual, holistic, lateral, or creative. And classes in this type of education are culled from production pipelines of Hollywood films. There are also job categories. Classes are generally called modeling, rigging, rendering, texturing. Tutorials offer formalized exercises as homework assignments, and these are commercial tutorials. It's a big business in the 3D world, digital tutorials that are sold online. Offer formalized exercises as homework assignments that reflect assembly line consciousness, make a cartoon walk cycle, model a grisly humanoid monster, or create a highly lacquered sports car. What is interesting is how educational tools inadvertently promote the unacknowledged production of a specific company style or brand. They teach not just skills, but aesthetics, conveying the values and ethos of an industry, not the industry of design and high-end consumer products. And now I'm wrapping up, yay. But one that is without any particularly edifying aspirations. While the seduction of Hollywood with its perceived lifestyle of glamour and creativity is certainly the carrot on the learn 3D and make it big in the entertainment industry stick, it was the assembly line production model of education that I believed was destructive for my students. I began to think it actually prevented them from using this new tool in unexpected ways, rather than endlessly repeating whatever ads they'd recently seen on TV. When I have another paragraph, that it's come to an end. I thought that I had timed it perfectly, but no. Hence, I had my pedagogical political awakening. I gradually developed and put into practice experimental 3D classes in which clusters of complementary skills were grouped together in unorthodox ways for their aesthetic and expressive potential. Surprisingly, students from performance, painting, sculpture, and experimental design departments who had previously been uninterested in 3D animation registered for the classes and joined. So 5.5 years after beginning the X3D project, these kinds of creatively motivated students continue to fill my classes, which are now also taught by former grad students, while the more production-oriented students have departed and gone elsewhere. I have no idea where. And I believe the parable of 3D animation is not merely about the evolution of a specific medium, but about the liberating function of contemporary art education in an otherwise frighteningly uniform corporatized world. And so this was a love story, I guess, that is partially about my experience in teaching artists, and that and how what began as a process of resistance actually evolved into something else that was very positivistic. So that's the end of the story.